I didn't plan to expose my family that night. I came to dinner with the same quiet intentions I'd carried for years. To sit where I was told, to smile when expected, to hold my daughter close, and leave without disturbing the balance everyone else seemed so comfortable maintaining. I told myself it was just another family gathering, another evening I could endure by staying small. My daughter was warm against my chest, her tiny fingers curled into my dress, her breathing slow and steady. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know what she represented. To her, I was just home. I expected to stay invisible. I expected silence to protect us. But then, my father stood up. He lifted his glass, his voice bright with pride, and began to speak about my sister's pregnancy, about how this baby would change everything, about how he was finally becoming a grandfather. People smiled. Someone clapped. A few voices cheered. His first grandchild. The words landed heavier than the glass ever could. Because in that exact moment, I understood what silence had cost me. Not just recognition, not just honesty, but 7 full months of my daughter's existence erased with a single sentence. 7 months of firsts, her first cry, her first smile, her first sound, reduced to nothing by a family that had never bothered to ask. I stood there holding proof of a life already lived, while they celebrated a future that hadn't happened yet. And that was when I knew this night wasn't going to end the way it always had. In the weeks leading up to that dinner, the pressure had been subtle but relentless. The kind of erosion that looks harmless until you realize there's nothing solid left under your feet. Because my mother had taken it upon herself to remind me. Every phone call and sideways comment that my younger sister was doing things properly while I was drifting, unmarried, quiet, and apparently unfinished. She talked endlessly about prenatal vitamins and nursery colors and baby showers I was expected to attend with a smile, and every time I tried to redirect the conversation toward my own life, she laughed it off like I was being charmingly evasive instead of deliberately guarded. "You're too private," she told me once, lightly, as if privacy were a character flaw instead of survival. And I remember looking at my daughter asleep in her bassinet afterward, and realizing that keeping her hidden wasn't just about fear, it was about control, about owning something in a family that had always treated my milestones as optional footnotes. The situation worsened when my sister started rewriting history out loud, telling relatives I wasn't ready for motherhood yet, saying she hoped her baby would inspire me to finally settle down, and no one challenged her because they never had, because I was the daughter who didn't demand space, who made things easier by saying nothing. I began to notice patterns then, how invitations went missing, how my name was absent from group messages, how my mother stopped asking about my weekends altogether, as if removing curiosity might erase evidence. It was during one of those quiet omissions that I uncovered the first piece of the truth, not through confrontation, but through paperwork, because a misaddressed baby registry email landed in my inbox, confirming that my sister had claimed to be the only child starting a family, and in that moment I understood this wasn't neglect, it was intentional. They hadn't forgotten me. They had edited me out. The person who changed everything didn't arrive with drama or speeches or loyalty declarations. She arrived with a casserole dish and a question no one in my family had ever asked me before, because my Aunt Ruth had always been the inconvenient relative, the one who showed up early and stayed too long and noticed things others preferred to smooth over. She came by the afternoon after the disastrous dinner, while my daughter napped in the next room, and I was still carrying the echo of my mother's words in my chest like a bruise. And as she set the dish down on my counter, she looked at me carefully and said, "Why are you carrying so much weight alone?" And I realized I didn't have a rehearsed answer for once. I hadn't told Ruth anything, not about the baby, not about the lies, not about the way my sister had been curating a version of the family where I barely existed, but Ruth had always been observant in a way that bordered on forensic, and when she asked to see the nursery, I hadn't shown anyone. Something in me loosened enough to let her follow me down the hall. She didn't gasp or cry or scold me when she saw my daughter sleeping there, small and real and undeniably present. She just sat down slowly in the rocking chair and said, very calmly, "So, they really don't know." And when I nodded, she reached for my hand and told me something I hadn't known until that moment, which was that my sister had been controlling the narrative for years, intercepting calls, canceling invitations on my behalf, telling relatives I was overwhelmed and didn't want company, framing my absence as preference instead of exclusion. Ruth had heard it all secondhand, stitched together from half-explanations and contradictions, and she admitted she'd suspected something was wrong long before I ever got pregnant. Because you don't simply stop existing in a family without someone pushing you out of frame. That was the first time I understood the scope of it, that this wasn't just favoritism, but coordination. And as Ruth rocked my daughter and talked quietly about the things she'd overheard, the picture finally sharpened into something undeniable. The turning point came not with anger, but with documentation, because Ruth had saved everything. Text messages forwarded to her by mistake, emails where my sister spoke for me without permission, group threads where my mother agreed I was too sensitive to include in planning, and when Ruth pulled her phone out and began scrolling, I saw my erasure laid out in timestamps and phrasing and deliberate choices. There were messages about baby showers I'd never been invited to, comments about how it would upset her if we talked about babies around her, lies that made my silence look like fragility instead of restraint. And I realized that while I'd been protecting my daughter quietly, someone else had been actively making sure she stayed invisible. That knowledge cost me something, because it meant accepting that this wasn't an accident that could be corrected with one heartfelt conversation. It was a system that had benefited them for too long to dismantle gently. Still, even with the truth in front of me, the losses kept coming. Because when Ruth suggested I tell my father privately, just him, just the facts, I tried and failed in a way that still aches when I think about it, because I sat across from him at his kitchen table a week later and told him he already had a granddaughter, and watched confusion flicker across his face before my mother stepped in, laughing lightly, dismissing it as stress, telling him I was exhausted and imagining things, and my father, who had always chosen the path of least resistance, nodded and let the moment pass. That was the loss that hurt most, not the disbelief, but the relief on his face when he accepted an explanation that allowed him not to act. And as I drove home afterward, I understood that waiting for permission to be seen was no longer an option. What I gained instead was clarity, and with it a plan that didn't involve shouting or ultimatums, because patience had always been my strongest skill, even if no one had valued it. I began collecting my own evidence, not just Ruth's messages, but birth records, medical files, dated photos, videos of first laughs and early mornings, proof that my daughter had lived a full life already, regardless of who acknowledged it. I documented the ways invitations had been redirected, the times my sister spoke for me, the financial records that showed gifts and heirlooms allocated without my knowledge, including a bracelet my grandmother had promised me that somehow appeared in my sister's jewelry box. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't correct the narrative yet. I simply let them continue believing I was unaware, because people who think they're undiscovered grow careless, and over time the story they told about me became more elaborate and easier to disprove. The unexpected ally turned out not to be a person, but timing itself, because my sister's baby shower approached with the kind of enthusiasm that makes families reckless, and as plans were finalized and speeches rehearsed, No one thought to check whether the daughter they'd written off might finally speak. I was still invited, of course, expected to attend, expected to smile, expected to perform gratitude for being allowed into a celebration built on my absence. And as I accepted the invitation politely, I realized that the stage they'd prepared for her was the same one where the truth could no longer be ignored. I wasn't planning revenge, not in the way they'd imagine it, because there would be no screaming or accusations, only facts introduced into a room that had relied on fiction for too long. And as I practiced what I would say, calmly and briefly, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not rage, but certainty. By the time the night arrived, I had already lost the illusion that being quiet would protect me, but I had gained something far more durable, which was the understanding that my worth had never been dependent on their recognition, and that when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't be because I demanded it loudly, but because I had waited long enough for it to become undeniable. The baby slept peacefully as I dressed that evening, unaware of the shift about to happen, and as I looked at her, I promised myself that whatever followed would be done with restraint and precision, because this wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about reclaiming reality, and once that door opened, there would be no way for them to close it again. The baby shower was held at my parents' house, which felt appropriate in a way that almost made me laugh, because that living room had been the stage for every comparison, every quiet correction, every reminder of who belonged in the center and who should hover politely at the edges. I arrived early, not out of eagerness but strategy, carrying a gift bag and the calm that comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do and why, and my mother greeted me with visible surprise, as if punctuality itself were a deviation from the version of me she preferred. She took the gift without looking inside, and immediately began issuing instructions: where to sit, who I should talk to, which topics were better avoided, and I listened with the same practiced attentiveness I'd used my whole life, because people speak most freely when they believe you're still compliant. As relatives filtered in, the room filled with pink balloons and forced cheer, and my sister took her place at the center like it had been reserved for her long before the furniture was arranged, glowing with attention and affirmation, soaking up praise as if it were oxygen. She hugged me briefly, whispering that she was glad I'd come, and I could hear the relief in her voice, the reassurance that the script was still intact, that I hadn't ruined anything by existing too loudly. My father hovered nearby, smiling proudly, already practicing the toast he'd been perfecting for weeks, and as I watched him interact with my sister's belly, speaking softly to a child not yet born, I felt the old sting rise again, but this time it didn't control me. It clarified me. When everyone was seated and drinks were poured, my father stood, tapping his glass gently, and the room quieted with the reverence reserved for tradition, because no one ever interrupted him, not even my mother, who deferred to him publicly while managing everything privately. He began to speak about family and legacy and how proud he was to finally become a grandfather, and as he talked about new chapters and fresh starts, I felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes flick toward me briefly and then away, as if my presence were an unresolved detail better ignored. I waited, because timing matters, and interrupting too early would have turned truth into spectacle instead of revelation. It was my sister who opened the door without realizing it, smiling brightly and gesturing toward me as she thanked everyone for their support and added lightly, "And maybe this will inspire my big sister to finally catch up." And laughter followed, easy and familiar, because they'd all heard that joke before and never questioned who it benefited. I stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same steady motion I used every morning when I lifted my daughter from her crib, and the room quieted out of curiosity rather than alarm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply said, "I need to correct something before we go any further." And the calm in my tone did more to still the room than shouting ever could. My mother's smile tightened immediately. My sisters froze, and my father frowned slightly, as if trying to place a detail that didn't fit. And I continued, explaining that I hadn't been waiting for inspiration or permission, that I had already become a mother months ago, and that the reason no one knew was not because I was ashamed or confused, but because the truth had been deliberately kept from them. The room erupted then, not into chaos, but into overlapping reactions, gasps and questions and denials, and my sister laughed sharply, calling it a misunderstanding, insisting I was exaggerating, but I didn't engage with her words. I engaged with the evidence, because facts don't argue back. I took my phone out and passed it first to my father, showing him a photo dated 7 months earlier, his granddaughter asleep on my chest in a hospital room, and I watched his face change as recognition replaced confusion, as the weight of what he'd missed settled visibly on his shoulders. My mother reached for the phone, protesting, saying this wasn't the time, that we could talk privately, but I shook my head gently and said that privacy was how this had been allowed to continue, and one by one I laid out the timeline, the intercepted messages, the canceled invitations, the heirloom bracelet that had vanished, the registry email that claimed my sister was the only one starting a family. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I simply connected dots they'd been trained not to see. My sister tried to interrupt again, her voice rising as she accused me of stealing attention, of being jealous, of ruining her moment. And for the first time, I looked directly at her and said, quietly, "You erased my child." And the room went silent in a way that felt final. My father sat down heavily, staring at the photo still open on my phone, and my mother began to cry. Not the soft, reflective kind, but the defensive kind. The kind meant to redirect blame, insisting she'd only wanted to protect everyone from stress. I told her that protection without consent is just control with better branding, and even as I said it, I felt strangely detached, as if I were finally speaking a language they couldn't translate into excuses. The climax didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came with the slow, dawning realization spreading through the room that the story they'd accepted so easily no longer held, that their laughter had been built on omission, that celebration had coexisted with erasure because it was convenient. My father asked, hoarsely, why he hadn't been told, and I answered honestly, saying that I'd tried, that I'd been dismissed, that silence had seemed safer until it became corrosive. My sister left the room abruptly then, tears streaking her makeup, and no one followed her, because for the first time the center of gravity had shifted and they weren't sure where to stand. I finished by saying that I wasn't there to punish anyone, that I wasn't asking for apologies or reparations, only acknowledgement, because reality doesn't need permission to exist, and my daughter didn't need their approval to matter. I sat back down, hands steady, heart surprisingly calm, and as the room slowly resumed breathing, I knew that regardless of what they chose to do next, the truth had been spoken in full daylight, and there was no way to fold it neatly back into silence again. The room didn't return to celebration after that. Not really, because once the truth settles into a space, it changes the acoustics, making every laugh sound tentative and every movement feel deliberate. And as plates of untouched food cooled on the table, people began to realize they were no longer attending a baby shower, but standing in the aftermath of something that couldn't be undone. I stayed seated, Not because I was weak, but because I had said everything I needed to say, and there is a particular kind of power in not filling silence once you've told the truth. My father sat across from me, shoulders slumped, turning my phone over in his hands as if the image of his granddaughter might disappear if he looked away too long. And when he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I remembered, asking how he could have missed 7 months of her life without noticing the gap. I told him quietly that absence doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it's disguised as order and smooth coordination, and that it thrives most in families that value harmony over honesty. My mother tried to gather the room back together, murmuring about emotions running high and how pregnancy makes everyone sensitive, but the familiar mechanisms no longer worked because people had seen too much, and even those who didn't fully understand what had happened sensed that something foundational had cracked. One cousin asked if they could see a picture of the baby, another asked her name, and each question felt like a small reclaiming of space, not triumphant, but necessary, and I answered calmly, letting my daughter be known without turning her into a symbol or a weapon. My sister didn't come back into the room, and that absence felt deliberate in a way my own had never been allowed to be. But for once, I didn't rush to fill it, because chasing her would have meant centering her again, and this moment wasn't about restoring her comfort. What followed in the days after wasn't neat or cinematic. It was slow and uncomfortable and deeply revealing, because truth doesn't resolve conflict, it exposes it, and my family had a lot exposed all at once. My father came to see me alone the following afternoon, sitting on my couch with his hands folded like a man waiting for a verdict, and when I placed my daughter in his arms, he began to cry in earnest, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet grief of realizing time has been taken from you without your consent. He apologized then, not defensively, not conditionally, but plainly, saying he should have listened sooner, that he should have noticed, and while his words didn't erase what had happened, they mattered because they were grounded in accountability instead of explanation. I told him I wasn't interested in punishing him for trusting the people closest to him, but that moving forward would require something different, something active, because love that doesn't intervene can become another form of abandonment. My mother took longer, days of silence punctuated by messages that hovered just short of responsibility, telling me she had only wanted peace, that she'd been trying to protect the family from conflict, and I replied once, carefully, saying that peace built on erasure isn't peace, it's convenience, and that I wouldn't participate in it anymore. That boundary felt heavier than any confrontation I'd ever imagined, because it didn't come with raised voices or ultimatums, just a clear line drawn without apology, and when she finally asked what I wanted from her, I told her the truth, which was consistency, transparency, and the understanding that my daughter would never be treated as secondary to anyone else's narrative. Whether she could offer that remained to be seen, but for the first time I wasn't negotiating the terms of my own worth. As for my sister, the reckoning unfolded in pieces rather than a single collapse, because the kind of control she'd exercised for years doesn't vanish overnight. It resists, reframes, and retreats strategically. She sent me a long message 3 days later, accusing me of humiliating her, of weaponizing motherhood, of stealing her moment, and I read it once before deleting it without responding, because engagement would have implied equivalence, and what she'd done wasn't a misunderstanding between equals, it was a sustained campaign of exclusion. Her anger didn't frighten me the way it once might have, because it was predictable, and predictability loses its power when you stop organizing your life around it. She would tell her version of the story, I knew that, casting herself as the injured party, but stories that rely on omission eventually collapse under the weight of evidence, and I had learned the value of letting time do that work. The practical consequences arrived quietly but decisively, because families adjust when they're forced to acknowledge reality, and over the following weeks, invitations began to come directly to me. Conversations included me without qualifiers, and my daughter's name appeared on cards and messages where once there had been silence. Some relatives apologized openly, others avoided the topic entirely, and I accepted both responses with the same calm distance, understanding that not everyone is capable of reflection at the same pace. What mattered was that my daughter was no longer invisible, and that I was no longer contorting myself to fit into a structure that required my absence to function. There were moments of grief, too, because reclaiming your narrative doesn't mean pretending the loss didn't hurt, and there were nights when I rocked my daughter to sleep and mourned the version of family I'd hoped for, the one where love didn't need to be negotiated or proven with documentation. I allowed myself that sadness without letting it pull me backward, because resilience isn't about pretending you're unaffected. It's about refusing to let pain dictate your future. I thought often about the years I'd spent shrinking my life to avoid conflict, about how being underestimated had felt safer than being targeted, and I understood then that patience is only virtuous when it serves your growth, not when it enables someone else's dominance. In the end, the most unexpected outcome wasn't revenge or vindication. It was self-reliance, solidifying into something unshakable, because I no longer needed my family to validate my choices for them to feel real. I had built a life quietly, intentionally, and when it was finally revealed, it didn't require embellishment or defense. It simply stood on its own. Watching my father learn how to hold his granddaughter, seeing him stumble and laugh and try again, reminded me that people can change when they're forced to confront the cost of their inaction, but I also knew that change would no longer be something I waited for before moving forward. The story didn't end with reconciliation neatly wrapped in a bow, because life rarely offers that kind of closure, but it ended with something more durable, which was clarity. And as I walked away from that season of my life, I did so without bitterness, carrying only the knowledge that I had chosen truth over comfort and self-respect over silence. My daughter slept peacefully through most of it, unaware of the dynamics shifting around her, and I took comfort in knowing that whatever family she grew up with would be shaped by boundaries I was no longer afraid to enforce. Sometimes, revenge isn't about watching someone fall, it's about standing up long enough to be seen, and sometimes the greatest triumph is simply refusing to let anyone rewrite your story ever again.